This was not a love story at first, it was a psychological collapse in real time. Tyson Kane presented the perfect profile of a high-functioning violent alpha whose trauma had shattered the boundary between threat and imagination. After the bombing, his paranoia escalated, his impulse control deteriorated, and 12 caretakers became 12 clinical failures. But the real horror starts when Baylor Finch enters the system. She is not medically trained, she is not protected by emotional distance, and yet she instinctively treats the one wound no one else understood: the unbearable humiliation of being seen as dangerous when the real terror is happening inside his own mind. That is why this case becomes deadly.
The position was an epitaph, written 12 times over. A dozen women were hired. A dozen women fled before the 12th day passed. The 13th was never meant to be there, a food courier caught in the gears of fate. She would be the one to halt the pattern. In Chicago's Gold Coast, the wealthy are entombed in towers, their lives hidden from the streets below where darkness thrives unseen. On the 62nd floor, Tyson Kane was the most dangerous of these hidden things. At 36, he wore the chaos he commanded like a second skin, a man so large that elevators felt like coffins, so wide his security detail appeared as children in his shadow. His hands had forged allegiances that defied the law, and his jaw was a monument to wrath, carved by a furious god who had left the edges rough. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a car bomb that had failed its mission 8 months earlier. A twice-broken nose was another chapter in his violent history. His aura entered a room before he did, a pressure that made waiters fumble and bartenders reach for his whiskey without a word. The real narrative, however, was in his eyes. Usually the flat gray of cold steel, they could collapse into black holes in his darkest moods. But sometimes they would soften into a deep sorrow, hinting that the world's most wounded soul was trapped in its most lethal vessel. I dare to see if anyone would ever look close enough. The explosion had caused a fracture deep within him. It had not killed him, but remade him, unmooring something fundamental that turned a meticulous empire builder into a man tormented by the echo of a blast, unable to tell friend from foe, and helpless against the violent thoughts that now ruled his mind. Impulses the old Tyson would have savagely silenced. The new Tyson gave him voice. The shield between his mind and his mouth had been incinerated with his vehicle. He needed a keeper, not because he was weak, but because his own mind was the one foe he could not threaten, bribe, or kill. So they sent 12 specialists. The first lasted 11 days. Running after a ringing phone at 3 a.m. made him launch the device at the wall beside her. The fourth held on for 5 days until he locked her in a closet for 3 hours because she had moved a folder on his desk. The 10th made it just 3 days. She bolted after he stared at her without blinking for 15 straight minutes before asking with deadpan sincerity if she knew how to dispose of a body. It was for business, he'd said. She didn't wait to find out. The 12th was their last shot. He managed 5 days of strained politeness and a steady voice. On day 6, the illusion broke. He annihilated the kitchen, accusing her of trying to poison him. After she left, he just sat in the wreckage until sunrise, his knuckles raw, his gaze empty, arriving at a single brutal conclusion: the women were never the problem. He was the problem. 12 caretakers were 12 separate confirmations of the fact. He was too damaged, too volatile, too much. And then, one Tuesday, a delivery girl arrived carrying a thermal tote, her hands marked with burn scars, and the entire story pivoted. This was the intersection where a set course of destruction collides with an unforeseen catalyst. It began that Tuesday night with a failing e-bike parked outside Chicago's most lavish address, and with a woman, Baylor Finch, who walked into a darkened penthouse, found a lethal man bleeding onto the floor, and, instead of running, did the one thing 12 professionals had not. She simply stayed. Baylor Finch was 27 but carried an exhaustion that felt ancient, a fatigue born not from labor, but from holding up a crushing weight for so long that her soul had forgotten how to be light. She moved through Chicago on an awkward e-bike for 3 shifts a day. Downtown offices in the morning, magnificent mile high-rises in the afternoon, and Gold Coast penthouses at night, where $300 dinners were frequently ordered and left untouched. A culinary graduate from Pilsen, her dream of her own kitchen had vanished the moment her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. After that, every cent Baylor earned was swallowed by the abyss of medical debt. Her mother had been gone for 2 years, but the debt lingered, $47,000 hanging above her head. Baylor lived under it in a 350-square-foot apartment where her kitchen was 4 strides from her bed, and the only window faced a brick wall. Between deliveries, she catered events, a party for 15, a lunch for 20, earning just enough to make an extra payment for Pearl. Pearl Finch, 19 and a freshman in college, had a slight limp, a consequence of a hard birth for which their mother had always blamed herself. Pearl needed a corrective operation that year, and her voice on the phone was always a little too bright. A strained performance to keep from picturing her sister on the streets at 10 at night, hands scarred by burns and body stiff with exhaustion. For 3 months straight, twice a day, Baylor brought food to Kane's penthouse but never saw him. Her world was a loop of lobby guards, elevator men, and the procession of 12 caretakers. They all had different faces, but wore the same hollowed-out look as they took the food, the stare of a person waiting for the world to end. They told her things, unburdening themselves. When people live in that kind of terror, the urge to speak is a dam breaking, and the delivery girl was a transient confessional, there long enough to hear, gone before the flood could take her too. The third one told her he made her cook his eggs 4 times. The 7th said he listened to her phone calls through the building's security. The 9th recalled one good evening, which he ruined the next day by demanding to know why she wasn't afraid. Certain her calm was a sign of a plot against him. Baylor heard it all with quiet resolve. She had 2 shifts left and no energy for the melodrama of the rich. But she saw one detail that all 12 of them had missed, a sign visible only to someone who has sat bedside while a loved one starves. The food trays were always returned with the meals, barely touched. It was not a sporadic thing, but a constant for 3 whole months. Baylor knew what it meant. She had seen it in her mother's final weeks. Her mother hadn't been refusing sustenance. She had been refusing the desolate ceremony of a meal on a tray, an empty chair across from her. People in that much pain don't just reject food. They reject the unbearable loneliness of eating by themselves, a silent admission that they are disappearing, and there is no one there to see it. Seeing those full trays night after night, Baylor knew. The man on the 62nd floor wasn't just refusing to eat, he was vanishing. And no one stayed long enough to watch. She did not know then that she would be the one, not on that Tuesday. She tore a length of cloth from a towel, wound it around his hand, and tied it with the fluid skill of someone who had tended countless small injuries. And Tyson Kane sat on the floor of his ruined kitchen, letting a complete stranger bind the wound he'd given himself. It wasn't a conscious choice, but an outcome so far outside his programming that his ingrained defenses failed to fire. He watched her, but not as he had watched the 12 before, not with the predatory, analytical stare that searched for betrayal. He observed her like a man seeing something impossible, like witnessing rain for the first time, with no words to name the water, falling from the heavens. Her simple act of care was clean of any agenda. It was not attached to a paycheck, a contract, or an instruction. She just crossed the broken shards, turned on the water, and did what was needed as an instinct, not a job. Tyson was completely unprepared to understand a person moved not by greed or by fear, but by a basic impulse to be kind. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice like grinding stone. The question wasn't a welcome, but a barricade from a man who saw only predators hunting his wealth or his throat. "I'm the one who delivers the meals you refuse," Baylor retorted, her eyes fixed on the crude bandage, alert for the slightest crimson bloom. "And you know I refuse them, how?" "For 90 days, the containers return with the same heft they had arriving." "You're tracking it?" "I don't need to," Baylor said, her eyes finally lifting to his. "The weight tells me everything." A thick quiet descended on Tyson. Not the furious vacuum before a storm that made staff run. This was the hush of a man pierced by a simple fact that slipped past every guard he had. It struck the last piece of him, capable of feeling anything at all. For 3 months, she was a phantom at his door he'd never seen. But she had watched him unravel frame by frame. She knew he was nearing an end. It was a perception beyond her duty, a ghost of a different time, of taking untouched trays from her own mother's room. Rejected food is seldom about the taste. It is the mark of a soul fading in darkness. Their gazes met, and in the broken space where dreams and waking life bled together, one clear question cut through the noise. "Are you here to be my 13th keeper?" The bridge between his thought and his voice had crumbled 8 months ago. So the question spilled out before his broken thoughts could catch it, the wildest thing he'd said in a season of wildness. Baylor met his stare, then her own glance fell to her hand, pressing fabric to his skin. A shard of glass from the broken plate was wedged against her fingers. It was small, keen-edged, and lay there like a silent threat. "You ask this of the woman holding a weapon to your wrist." Then a change flickered on Tyson Kane's face. It wasn't a grin. A grin required muscles long dormant, but this was something dangerously near. Too near. It felt like a door, welded shut for 8 months, was finally trembling. Not swinging open, but for the first time, the lock was undone. From the kitchen's shadow, Bennett Shaw witnessed it all. In 15 years serving Tyson, he'd watched 12 qualified experts come and go. None had ever provoked so much as a flicker on his master's stone-like face. The girl stood, plucked the glass from her hand, and threw it away. She offered one last remark on her way out. "I'm not a keeper, but you have to eat. This is cold, but it's better than what's in your fridge, which is nothing at all." Which means anything is a step up. Then she was gone. Tyson stayed at the frigid tiles, his hand wrapped in cloth. And for the first time in 4 months, he removed the lid. And he ate. The food was bland and chilled. It didn't matter. He ate. Bennett said nothing. Nothing was needed. He just burned the name on the order into his mind. Baylor Finch. The next morning, Bennett Shaw called her before her shift. Baylor cut him off before he could finish the offer. "No," she said, her voice flat. The choice made hours before in the dark. The decision made at 3 a.m. held firm at 7. "I deliver food. I don't nurse broken giants." Bennett's tone was unshaken. He named a number 8 times her current wage, a sum that could suffocate anyone from her neighborhood. Baylor admitted it caught her own breath before reason took over. "The answer is no." She hung up, got on her worn e-bike, and rode toward Lincoln Park with an order, dismissing the call as a strange fever dream. The following day, nothing. She thought it was over. Men like him have endless options and don't ask a South Side girl twice. She could not have been more wrong. On day 3, weary, she came home to find an envelope on her table. A note from Pearl said a messenger dropped it off. Inside was a file, a complete ledger of her mother's medical debt. Every sheet, every line item, every dollar Baylor had bled for over 2 years was laid out in cold print, the final sum in bold, $47,000. It stared back at her like a death that would never die. Slipped into the folder was Bennett Shaw's card with 4 handwritten lines on the back. Mr. Kane will settle this. No conditions, no ties. All you must do is try. 2 weeks. Baylor sank onto her bed, staring at the number, hating that her first reaction was not rage, but release. A dangerous flicker of hope, an exit offered for the first time in 2 years. She despised the feeling because nothing from Tyson Kane's world was ever free. To agree meant stepping into a storm with no way out. Men of his kind don't cancel debts from generosity. They do it to forge a different kind of chain, one that money cannot break. That is where the real cost begins. Yet Pearl had surgery pending. The doctor said waiting past her 20th birthday cut the chance of success in half. Pearl turned 20 in November, and that $47,000 ghost now had a new $40,000 companion. Baylor worked 3 jobs, but numbers don't care about struggle. Numbers only see the total. And her total wasn't enough. She called Bennett back at 11 that night. He picked up instantly, as though he were waiting. He probably was. 2 weeks, Baylor said. That's it. 14 days and I'm out. And you will stay out of my life, because the next time I won't be so polite. Bennett paused, a short, calculated silence that promised nothing. He'd hired the 12 women before her, and they all made similar speeches, and every single one had quit before the 2 weeks were up. He offered no hint that she would be different. He just said, "A car will be there for you tomorrow at 8. Baylor ended the call. Her gaze went from the folder to Pearl's door. Hearing her sister's quiet breaths, she told herself 14 days couldn't change a thing. She was mistaken. Again. The SUV arrived at 8 on the dot, black with dark windows, the kind Baylor saw only in movies or sliding past her on the Gold Coast, making her wonder if the people inside knew what a gallon of milk cost. She held 2 grocery bags. 4 months had proven the fridge on floor 62 was for show. And she refused to cook with anything that had been around longer than her ex-boyfriend's. The lift opened straight into the suite. This time, light poured in. The sky over Chicago was a mural framed by floor-to-ceiling glass. Baylor could finally see what she had only felt in the gloom. The home was a monument to wasted money. Marble from Italy. Furniture bought for its tag, not for comfort. A heavy silence was woven into the rooms, as if the very air was on a payroll. Yet Baylor walked by the sitting room, the dining hall, and the view that would grace a magazine cover. She went straight for the kitchen and stopped cold. The counters were Calcutta stone, its pale gray veins running like rivers. A 6-burner range, a model she knew was handcrafted in France. It was the exact one her cooking teacher showed the class once, saying, "You'll never own this, but you need to know it exists." Dual ovens, a hood of beaten copper, a built-in wall for wine, and every surface wore a fine layer of dust that only settles on things that are never, ever used. Baylor laid her palm on the countertop, tracing a vein, like a player touching an instrument they could never possess, but instantly understood. She pulled open the oven door. Within were 3 manila files and a roll of packing tape. She then opened the fridge. A fortnight-old carton of takeout sat there, a relic of a forgotten meal. Tyson occupied the doorway, a still silhouette filling the space, his eyes on her, sharp and watchful, not hostile, just alert. "What is this kitchen?" she whispered, her back to him, studying the refrigerator like evidence. It was part of the unit. She turned, her gaze sweeping from his face to the oven full of documents and back. "So you're using a concert grand piano to hold your mail." His response was silence, punctuated by the arch of a single scarred brow. It was all the permission Baylor needed. She began her work, no approval sought, no words exchanged, no reason offered for her trespass. She unpacked the supplies bought in Pilsen at 6 o'clock that morning and began to coax a soul back into a room that had lost its own. A blue corona of flame blossomed from the stovetop, a quiet act of reclamation. The air filled first with butter and onions, then garlic, then thyme. A symphony of scents that spoke of patience, not of haste. It was the aroma of deliberation and time, and for the first time in 8 months, it wove through the sterile penthouse, suggesting the opulent cage could perhaps become a sanctuary. Baylor set the meal before Tyson. He was pulled to the table not by her, but by a primal instinct that 8 months of seclusion had failed to smother. He ate one bite and then stopped cold. Not from distaste, but because the flavor was so fundamentally right that his entire being recoiled in shock. It was like vision, returning after a lifetime in shadow. This meal was the first honest thing, not a prescription or an act of pity, but simply butter and garlic and pure, undiluted care. Each dish was a story, made by a woman whose own history was written on her hands. "Is it acceptable?" Baylor asked, her weight against the marble counter telegraphing a quiet confidence. "It will suffice," Tyson returned, yet a deep seismic fault line shifted within him. A vault, sealed for 8 long months, began to grind open, offering a sliver of the man trapped inside, someone relearning the forgotten language of kindness, offered not as payment, but as a silent acknowledgement of a shared world. At 3 a.m, on her second day, a frantic, hammering percussion at her door tore Baylor from sleep. It was not a knock, but a desperate, uncontrolled battery, the sound of a man whose terror had overwhelmed his formidable power. When she opened the door, Tyson Kane was a hulking shadow, the gloom of the hall reflecting a feral fear in his eyes. This was not the rage that had made his former caretakers run. It was the unadulterated terror of a frightened boy locked inside the body of a monster. "I need pancakes," he said. His voice was a monotone, as if a 3 a.m. summons for breakfast was a routine affair for a shoeless magnate of crime. Baylor processed the man, the time, and the man again. 3 o'clock in the morning. He just gave a slight nod, completely divorced from the scene's absurdity. She did not argue. In the kitchen, one flick of a switch created a solitary island of light in the vast, darkened residence. He shadowed her, a silent sentinel at the counter, as she mixed the batter. Beyond the glass, the night was a bottomless well. Chicago at 3 o'clock in the morning tells the city's most honest, stripped-down truths. And in that small haven of kitchen light, a strange truce was forged. Not with a contract, but with pancakes. "Why this time of night?" she asked, her attention fixed on the sizzle of the pan. "I don't trust the dark," he answered. He stated it like a medical diagnosis, not a poetic disclosure. It was a chronic condition, a non-negotiable piece of his reality, like a deadly food allergy or an intolerance to milk. The darkness was simply the opponent. Baylor slid a plate of pancakes before him and took the opposite chair. The light settled between them, a small, defended shore against an encroaching sea of black. It was then she asked the question that 12 others before her never got the opportunity to voice, lacking the quiet authority she possessed. What did the dark ever do to you? A heavy stillness fell over Tyson, but it was not the silence that heralds a coming violence. It was the sound of a man searching for a vocabulary he had never required, as no one before had ever stayed around to hear it. "It looks like my own head," he said at last, his eyes locked on his plate. "Too many things inside I can't see clearly." And just like that, the woman from Pilsen had demanded the city's most powerful man name his monster, and he had given her the truth. At 3 a.m, over pancakes on their island of light, a silent coup had taken place after 8 months of brutal war. Tyson had spoken his fear aloud and had broken nothing. He was just a man admitting his terror of his own mind to a woman who gave no sign of wanting to run. Baylor offered no useless platitudes. She merely nodded and nudged the syrup toward him. They finished their meal in a bizarrely normal silence at 3 a.m., but the quiet was built on unstable ground. By the 4th day, the very air had changed. When Baylor served him lunch, Tyson's eyes were different. The paranoia was back. The same sickness the last employee saw before the kitchen was systematically destroyed. "You eat it first," he ordered. His voice was dead, but his eyes were a maelstrom of mistrust. "Every single thing on the plate. You will taste it." Baylor saw it instantly. This was the illness talking, not the man. She had been preparing for this test. The paranoia in his shattered consciousness was a tide, and it had just reached its peak. Wordlessly, she raised a fork. She tasted the meat, her chewing slow and methodical. She ate the vegetables. She sampled the sauce. Her actions were seamless and utterly calm. This was no act. It was a practiced, ingrained response, a serenity earned over years of taking her mother's pills first to prove they were not poison. Testing food for a paranoid crime boss. This was a familiar routine. Her steady gaze met his turbulent one. "If I wanted to kill you," she said, her voice low, "I would just let you eat the old takeout in the fridge. Slower maybe, but just as certain." And in that silence, the impossible happened. Tyson Kane laughed. Not a smirk, but a raw, deep laugh that came from his gut. It was a sound pulled up from a place long buried, like a rusted machine jolting violently to life. The sound was harsh, out of practice, but it was completely real. Further down the hall, Bennett stopped dead. In 15 years, he had almost never heard his boss laugh, and never with such raw, unguarded feeling. It was the sound of a man stumbling upon a lost piece of his own humanity. By the 6th day, Baylor knew. That laugh was not a cure. It was a break as the clouds, and a clear sky doesn't mean the hurricane has passed. She was making dinner in the kitchen when a sharp, violent crack echoed from his office. This was not an accident. It was the specific sound of something thrown against a wall by a man weighing more than 100 kilograms. A man who had just lost all semblance of control. The shouts began right after. Tyson was drowning in delusions that he was being watched, that microphones were hidden, that every word was being recorded to be used against him. His voice was laced not with anger, but with a bone-deep terror, as if the very room were shrinking to crush him. His certainty was so complete that reason was a foreign language. The fear was not born in logic, but in the part of his psyche that had been broken 8 months before. No one knew how to fix it. Bennett appeared in the hall, a sedative in his hand, his face a well-rehearsed blank. This was his grim procedure. Enter, inject, count to 180, and then deal with the wreckage. But Baylor stood in his way. She blocked his path, giving up 20 kilos in weight. Her voice was quiet, but it held absolute command. No, I'll handle it. Bennett could only gape at her as if she had just volunteered to tame a starving wolf. And the animal inside was most certainly howling. She gave no reason as she walked directly into the heart of the chaos. The office was a whirlwind of destroyed paper. A laptop was half buried in the drywall. A bookcase was listing, ready to fall. And in the center stood Tyson, his back to her, every muscle tensed like a winch cable, his breathing a harsh, tearing sound. She didn't speak. She just sank to the floor 2 meters away and put her back against the wall. She became perfectly still. Tyson spun, his eyes burning through her, seeing a different world. He did not register her or the office. He saw only enemies hiding in the dark. She did not flinch. 1 minute passed, then a second. 3 minutes of choked silence, cut only by his gasping breaths and the ticking of a clock that had somehow survived the destruction. Then Baylor started to talk, her voice a low, steady drone. The kind of voice used to soothe a fevered child, where the sound itself is the comfort, not the words, a signal that they are not alone. She told him about her mother, not the strong woman, but the woman at the end of her life, when drugs no longer worked against the pain and the only thing left for her to do was scream. It was a type of scream that exists beyond words, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, the noise a body produces when its torment is too great to name. And Baylor, first at 15 years old, then at 25, had done nothing but sit with her, night after night, completely helpless. There were no solutions left, no medicine to give, no magic words to stop the hurt. Her only purpose was to be there, so her mother knew that when she screamed, her screams did not disappear into an empty room. "Sometimes people don't need a fix," she said, her voice steady, her eyes on the floor to grant him his space. "Sometimes they just need someone brave enough to stay in the storm with them." Tyson remained standing. The storm inside him receded, not with a crash, but in measured waves, breath by breath, an edifice dismantled from its core. He remained standing, though the demolition was complete. The screaming had died. He stood motionless in the ruin of his office, hearing the woman on the floor tell a story of her mother. For the first time in 8 months, a storm passed without sedation, quieted by a voice that knew this kind of dark and did not run. Bennett froze in the doorway, needle in hand, witness to a tableau his brain refused to assemble. Then, on day 8, at 4 a.m, Baylor opened her eyes. Not to a noise, but to an instinct, a sixth sense sharpened by years beside her mother's bed, where every subtle change was a silent alarm. Opening the door revealed Tyson's silhouette. He wasn't knocking, nor preparing to. He was just an immovable fixture in the hall. The predator was absent, though. In its place stood a man drowning in the immense solitude of 4 a.m. His eyes were caverns, no glint of madness, only a bone-deep weariness. "What's wrong?" Her voice was a sleep, graveled whisper, free of annoyance, trained for emergencies that cared nothing for her own peace. I had to see if you were real, he breathed, the admission unvarnished and fragile. I am still here, she confirmed. Good. He turned without another word and retreated down the corridor. Baylor watched from her doorway as the shadows reclaimed him. Chicago's phantom emperor making sure at 4 a.m. that his last remaining anchor was not an illusion. And then the thought crystallized. The most chilling spectacle in this home was not the rage, but the sight of its reigning hunter, terrified of the dawn, finding him alone. Day 9 brought Franklin Kane. He materialized from the elevator, a specter arriving unannounced in the penthouse via a private code, a relic of his old dominion. Every step was a calculated assertion of ownership, a silent claim that this ground was his, no matter what the paperwork said. At 62, Franklin Kane was a spare man of medium height, rendered in a perfect gray suit and smoothed silver hair. An outsider would see a distinguished academic or a retired judge, a man whose face invited absolute trust. He offered a spray of white lilies, setting them on the table with the polished ease of a kindly uncle. His smile was a masterpiece of engineered warmth. Without prior knowledge, Baylor would have believed it genuine. But her own investigation, the ghost stories of 12 previous caregivers, painted another picture entirely. One, Constance Quinn, had noted a vicious cycle. After every visit from Franklin, Tyson would shatter for at least 3 days. Constance never learned the reason, only the poison of the result. Baylor watched as Franklin moved through the space, taking Bennett's hand with the weight of a king who never truly gave up his crown before settling beside Tyson. His questions about Tyson's well-being were soft, spoken with the unhurried calm of a man who commands time itself. Then, his eyes fell upon Baylor, not to look but to appraise, a systematic cataloging from her shoes to her hair. It was the dispassionate stare of a broker weighing an asset against a liability. He politely asked who she was, and before she could answer, Bennett cut in. She is the new caregiver. Franklin gave a serene nod, his placid smile expressing relief that his nephew was well cared for. His hand came to rest on Tyson's shoulder, a movement shaped like comfort that Baylor read as a claim of property. The visit was a perfectly timed performance of 20 minutes. He asked all the right things about medicine, about sleep, about the doctor's reports. Every inquiry was smart, considerate, and drove a sliver of frost into Baylor's core. She was used to open threats. A knife you can see is far safer than one hidden behind a warm greeting. Tyson did not utter a single word. He was a sculptor of absolute stillness, his slate blue eyes locked on his uncle, never blinking. His body was a high-tension cable humming with strain, and Baylor knew it wasn't peace. It was the immense, straining effort of suppressing a detonation. Franklin Kane left. The moment the elevator doors slid shut, Tyson broke. It was not the usual explosion of breaking glass and fury. This was far more terrible. He stood, faced Baylor, and his eyes, which had been empty or even soft, now held a look of raw, unfiltered dread. This was the terror of facing a real demon, the kind that makes you doubt your own mind's ability to fight it. Accept nothing he gives you, he rasped, his voice low and urgent. Don't talk to him. Don't look him in the eye. Baylor almost asked why, but Tyson was already gone, the lock on his bedroom door clicking like a vault ceiling shut. The quiet that followed was a physical weight. Bennett guided her to the balcony, the one place without eyes or ears, where only the 62nd floor wind could serve as a witness. There, Bennett laid out the bones of the war. Tyson's father, Frank's own brother, died when Tyson was 26. For 10 years, Frank ran the organization until a council vote forced him to cede control to his nephew. 8 months back, Tyson's car exploded on Lakeshore Drive. The official story was a mechanical flaw. Bennett knew better. His own digging led to a garage, a shadow property of Frank's that had last serviced the car. It was not enough proof for a verdict in their world, but it was enough for Bennett. Frank's strategy had changed to a slow siege. He didn't need another bomb. He just had to manufacture the idea that Tyson was losing his mind, giving the council a reason to push him out. Frank would then glide back into power, and the kingdom would be his again. Bennett looked straight at Baylor, and she saw a flicker of what looked like actual worry. "You're the piece he didn't plan for," Bennett said. "Tyson's getting better. That's the one thing he can't allow." On that balcony, 62 floors high, Baylor saw the new reality. She was not here to nurse a broken man. She was standing at the heart of a quiet battle she never enlisted in, could barely grasp, and could not leave without a price on her head. In this world, knowledge was a permanent stain, and Baylor Finch was now marked. 2 weeks passed in a thick silence. The deadline loomed, unspoken, because to mention it was to ask for a promise heavier than her first one. 2 weeks, that's it. The penthouse was changing, its sterile, monumental emptiness slowly giving way to the pulse of life. The kitchen had become a place where things were made. A film of dust no longer covered the 6-burner stove. Instead, the aroma of real meals filled the air. On the 62nd floor balcony, Baylor started a small garden of herbs, basil, thyme, and rosemary, in simple clay pots. She ignored the irony of growing things in a mob boss's fortress. Tyson was eating, though every meal was a war. Sometimes the plate was an enemy he stared down. Other times the poison paranoia returned, and he made her taste his food. But he ate. A milestone the 12 women before her never reached. By night, he allowed her to keep watch in the living room while he tried to sleep. Not in his chamber, but just beyond his door, where she read under a single lamp. Just knowing another person was awake and near seemed to be enough to buffer the storm in his head. The sleep came in fragments, but it came. Then, one night toward the end of the 3rd week, she saw him by the window gazing down at the city. It wasn't his typical patrol, just a man watching it sprawl, looking small and adrift in the heart of his empire. Below, Chicago was a brilliant snare of lights, a grid of influence he had once ruled. From the 62nd floor, he wasn't its master, but a ghost haunting its peak. Baylor knew that silhouette, the shape of a man watching a life that was proceeding without him. 12 of them left, he said, his back to her, the words flat and cold. Not a lament, just an entry in the accounting of his solitude. I counted. Baylor came to the window beside him, her eyes tracing the same glittering chart of the city. There was nothing to gain by saying they fled because he was too broken, too dangerous, or too much work. It was all correct and all irrelevant. She didn't deal in obvious truths when a deeper one was available. "I'm not here because you require a warden," she said, her voice firm, though a subtle vibration ran beneath it. "I am here because this is the only place I've found where the size of my own damage doesn't block the hallway." That got through to him. Tyson turned from the window. She held her focus on the room, a ridiculously vast chamber with ceilings built for giants, an empty chasm one man had rattled in alone for 8 months. "There is enough space in here." Her voice dropped, a confession to herself. For all the broken things we're both carrying. That one line was code for $47,000 in medical bills, a mother in her grave, a sister needing surgery, 3 jobs a day, scarred hands, and the dream of a restaurant buried right beside her mom. She said all of it without speaking a word of it. Only the phrase broken things, and Tyson heard it. He heard everything. The mental switch that had been blown didn't just make him speak the raw truth. It made him hear the truths everyone else kept locked away. "You're not going anywhere," he said. It was a statement with the same flat certainty as his arrival at her apartment at 4 a.m. that first Tuesday. It wasn't a question, but a fact clicking into its final correct place. "Your kitchen is a certified biohazard," Baylor shot back, the edge of her lip twitching. "And your diet is a war crime against the human body. Leaving now would be professional malpractice." And then it happened. Tyson Kane laughed. It wasn't the rusted, grinding noise from the 4th day, but a real explosive laugh that erupted from a place so deep it seemed to shake loose years of settled dust. A place locked down since before the bomb, before the empire, back when he was just a boy in Frank Kane's house, not yet knowing the world his family built would one day try to eat him alive. The sound ricocheted off the penthouse walls for the first time, and the empty space seemed to drink it as if dying of thirst. And Baylor just stood there listening to a crime boss laugh because she insulted his kitchen, and she thought it was the most real thing she had ever heard. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was 100% real. And you don't find real on the 62nd floor. Pearl's call came on a Thursday. Her voice was pure light, so full of joy that Baylor felt the laughter before she understood the words. For a second, Baylor almost forgot she was in a syndicate boss's kitchen and felt like she was home, hearing her sister's daily report. "Sis, I got an internship," Pearl said. "A company found me on the school's career site. It's totally legit. They said I'm the perfect fit for their program, and get this, it comes with a scholarship. Can you believe it? I won't have to pay for a thing." Baylor asked for the company's name. Pearl said it, and in that moment, Baylor's world cracked in two. This wasn't some dramatic slow-motion movie effect, but the cold, hard stop of a system crash, a cognitive freeze, followed by a flood of horrifying new information. That name was a known quantity. She had seen it, a ghost on a page in Tyson's office on the 6th day, a day she'd spent on the floor, sorting through chaos. There in the wreckage was a list of shell companies Bennett had circled in red, and the name Pearl just said was third on that list with a fatal checkmark and Bennett's handwriting next to it, part of FK's network. Frank Kane was moving on her sister. Her call with Pearl ended with a voice of solid ice. "Don't sign anything. Don't move. I'll take care of it." The command was a frozen wall, holding back the tide of Pearl's panic, but Baylor's own hand was shaking so hard she had to drop her phone. She found Tyson in the living room, occupying the couch, his eyes fixed on nothing, that place between the real world and some battlefield in his head. It had become his default state, but as she got closer, his gaze lifted to her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she saw a completely new emotion. It wasn't the usual ghost of fear or the fog of stress. It was undiluted rage, a focused, crystalline fury, infinitely more deadly than his chaos, because unlike the chaos, this rage had a target. "Your broken world just bled into my sister's," she said, her voice ablaze. "I handled the 3 a.m. meltdowns. I handled the wreckage. I was your royal poison tester. I sat on the floor of your ruined office talking about my dead mother to keep you sane. But Pearl is sacred ground. Pearl did not sign on for this. She's just a student with a bad leg trying to have a normal life. If your darkness swallows her, I won't just be cleaning your kitchen. I will disappear, and I will take your balance with me. Tyson's eyes locked on hers, and inside them a switch flipped. It wasn't a slow healing. It was the clean, sharp click of a circuit re-engaging. His gray-blue eyes, always lost in a traumatic haze, snapped into a state of cold, vicious clarity. These were the eyes Bennett hadn't seen in 8 months. The eyes of the man who ran an empire with surgical focus before an explosion blew it all apart. Tyson rose to his feet. In that one motion, his presence filled the room, reclaiming the air with an authority that had been dormant for months. It wasn't about his size. It was the undeniable aura of pure power, the calm of a predator who feels no need to hide what he is. "Bennett," he said, his voice a low frequency that cut the penthouse silence. Bennett was in the hall in under 3 seconds. His speed wasn't about being close by. It was a wired-in reflex to that specific tone of voice, the voice of his commander, a sound he hadn't heard in 8 months, but that was as programmed in him as a soldier's reaction to a call to arms a decade after a war. "Pearl Finch student," Tyson said, naming her exact university, a piece of information Baylor had never shared, proving that some part of his broken mind had been quietly mapping her world this whole time. "Protect her 24/7 starts now. Nobody gets close to her. Nobody talks to her. Nobody puts a hand on her." Bennett's eyes flashed between Tyson and Baylor. A hint of disbelief crossed his face before he killed it. In 15 years, Bennett had never seen Tyson order a protection detail for anyone but himself. And here he was, calling in a full security team for the catering girl's sister, speaking with the absolute authority of the man they all thought had died on Lakeshore Drive 8 months ago. Bennett gave a sharp nod and vanished. Tyson then turned his eyes on Baylor. "No one will touch your sister," he promised. It wasn't a soft comfort. It was a decree from a man who could bend the world to his will, playing by a set of rules his world allowed and the normal one didn't. Baylor met his gaze, really seeing his gray-blue eyes, now terrifyingly sharp and alive, for the first time since she arrived. In that second, she knew what had finally pulled Tyson Kane back to solid ground. It wasn't the meds, the 3 in the morning pancakes, or her stories told on his ruined office floor. Those were just bandages. The cure was a mission. The cure was having something to protect other than himself for the first time in 8 months. And that something was Pearl Finch, the sister of the one woman who hadn't run from the monster. After the Pearl incident, Tyson's mind began to clear. It wasn't a fix, not a complete recovery, but the gaps of light between the shadows started to last longer. In those lucid moments, his normalcy was so shockingly complete that Baylor could almost forget who he was. Then a random comment or a long stare into nothing would shatter the image. One afternoon, during one of those clear periods, she was cooking while he watched from the kitchen entrance, his usual spot. She spoke without turning around. "Get in here. I'm going to teach you to chop an onion." She was tired of him haunting his own home like a ghost. And she figured if she ever had to leave, he should at least know how to not live on takeout. Tyson walked into the kitchen. He took the knife she offered, and she knew, just from his grip, before the blade even met the onion, that something was very, very wrong. The way he held the knife wasn't about cooking. It was about expert violence. His grip was a piece of muscle memory, learned from using blades for things that had nothing to do with the kitchen. With the blade reversed, his wrist locked, and his shoulders tight, his posture was a clear statement of deadly purpose, not meal prep. "You're chopping a vegetable, not settling a score," Baylor said with her typical bluntness. A twitch in his shoulders, a small signal she knew was a hidden smile, was his only answer. She then walked over and did something the 12 previous caretakers would have called insane, knowing exactly what those hands could do. She put her hand on top of his. Hers was small, traced with the faint, silver lines from a kitchen burn years ago. That little scarred hand covered his, a hand so big it made hers look like a child's. His knuckles were a map of 2 decades living in a world where violence is a first language. With a light pressure, she started to take apart his deadly grip, turning the handle, coaxing his fingers to uncurl, and moving them into the right place. His index finger and thumb finally pinched the base of the blade with the other 3 on the handle. At last, his wrist went slack and the tension flowed out of his shoulders. A hand that had only ever dealt in death was now being sheathed by one seamed with fire scars, learning the heft of a simple blade. Tyson's eyes fell to their joined hands, but he offered no words. Language felt insufficient for a moment of this gravity. This was one of them. He brought the knife down on the onion. The result was a ruin. The cuts were a crude wreckage of thick chunks and paper-thin slivers, the work of a man holding a weapon for its true purpose for the first time. Baylor voiced no judgment. She said only, "That's good," and slid the pieces into the pan. That night, they ate the first meal Tyson had a hand in making, and though his part was merely butchered onions, a tectonic change was felt by them both. Later, at 2 a.m, Baylor was reading when she heard the soft padding of bare feet against marble. Tyson materialized in the kitchen, bathing the room in the low glow of the island lights before settling onto a stool. She followed without a word and started on noodles, knowing this late-night sojourn was not about hunger. The kitchen had become his hallowed ground, a place of soft light and spice, a shelter from the storm inside his head. When sleep eluded him, this was the only place that granted him any measure of peace. She set the bowl of noodles before him. He ate for a beat, then stilled, his chopsticks laid to rest. With his gaze lost in the bowl, he simply began to talk. There was no preamble, no gentle approach. The words came out raw, without artifice or armor, as they so often did now that the guard at his lips had fallen. He told her of the bombing, not for Dr. Voss's clinical files, not for Bennett's official reports, but for her alone, in the 2 a.m. stillness over a bowl of noodles. He recounted driving and hearing a click, a faint metallic whisper almost lost in the engine's drone. But he had heard it. His life was built on noticing the imperceptible. In that sliver of a second, he knew. The detonation, he said, was not the worst of it. His voice frayed to a thread, pulling her closer, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the porcelain. It was the 3 seconds before, the instant I knew what was coming and I was utterly powerless to intervene. 3 seconds, sealed in that car, knowing it was over. My hands were on the wheel and there was nothing, not a single thing I could do, and those 3 seconds, they don't end. The blast is over, the hospital is over, but those 3 seconds are infinite. Every night I shut my eyes and I'm back in that car. I hear the click, I know, and I am helpless all over again. Baylor just watched him. the most feared man in Chicago, bearing the shattered pieces of his spirit to a food courier at 2 a.m, and she understood he needed no empty platitudes about strength, no false promises of a dawn that might never break. Words were a clumsy medium for them both. All he required was one person who could stare into his void and not turn away. She reached across the island, her hand covering his. This was not a moment from a film. There were no sparks, no rising music. It was the same unwavering, grounding pressure she had given her mother in a sterile hospital room. A quiet oath. I am here. It is dark, but you're not walking it in solitude. Those 3 seconds are over, she whispered, her palm a warm weight on his skin. Surviving isn't the war. The real battle is letting yourself believe you're allowed to keep living. Tyson looked up, and something in his gaze splintered. A change she hadn't seen since she first walked into his gilded cage. The edge, the emptiness, the terror, the paranoia, the frost. It all receded like a tide, leaving only softness behind. Here we see the dismantling of a legend. The slate-blue eyes, so long hidden behind a fearsome public mask, are finally seen by the one person who dared to pierce the walls of his solitude. In that quiet kitchen at 2 a.m, over a bowl of cooling noodles, Baylor's choice to stay, her hand on his, became a fulcrum in their story. This was her crossing of the Rubicon, a point of no return, yet she felt irrevocably anchored to the moment. That feeling of being moored was more frightening than any crime boss. The next afternoon, Bennett's appearance violated the sanctuary. His words were a brutal imposition from the world outside. Frank has called a council for tomorrow. He's planning a coup using the defection of the 12 caretakers as his justification for war. Frank had reframed Dr. Voss's clinical reports on Tyson's trauma as a weapon, bolstering them with staff accounts of his erratic behavior. This carefully constructed portfolio of his decline presented a singular narrative. The boss was irrevocably damaged, a danger to the organization, and who was better suited to take the reins than the old guard traditionalist Franklin Kane? Tyson's attendance is absolute, Bennett declared. He must present the image of the man he was, controlled, decisive. His absence or any hint of frailty is his surrender. Frank will usurp his entire empire, legitimized by the evidence he's so meticulously compiled. Baylor's question sliced through the machinations. What was Tyson's actual condition? A deep, heavy silence consumed the room. Bennett's eventual answer was a stark portrait of collapse. It is day 3, no sleep. The shaking and the paranoia are intensifying. This morning he clawed at his skin until it bled, certain something crawled beneath it. Boss wants to sedate him, but a sedated leader is a leader already dethroned. His eyes locked on her, the look of a man playing his final gambit. The bet was a young woman in a flour-dusted apron in a penthouse kitchen, the 62nd floor. With that silent entreaty left hanging in the air, he was gone. Baylor remained alone, her gaze fixed on a trembling basil plant, her thoughts divorced from the Byzantine power struggles of a world she didn't know or care for. Her mind drifted instead to her mother, to the endless nights where agony rendered sleep impossible. Baylor would sit beside her, helpless, absorbing a core truth. When faced with the incurable, one must cleave to the tangible. For Baylor, that constant was the kitchen. At 6 that evening, she started. There was no intricate plan, just a quiet, singular aim to remake this cold, sterile kitchen into a haven, a place Tyson Kane's splintered mind would recognize as safe. She began with chicken soup, the very emblem of solace, its aroma, a universal signal of comfort, not of danger. Next came a baked pasta, a recipe she had mastered in culinary school, its fragrance of garlic butter and cheese, a languid, warm invitation saturating the sterile air. The last piece was the bread. She kneaded the dough by hand on the cool marble, a gentle cloud of flour rising before she slid it into the oven. The scent of baking bread was the final one to claim the apartment, an aroma so primal in the human spirit as incapable of malice that no traumatized mind could read it as a threat. The fragrance of fresh bread is the essence of home, and home is the final sigil of sanctuary. This was the only medicine Tyson Kane truly needed, and so she cooked all through the night. These scents journeyed down the hall, a quiet, aromatic assault seeping under Tyson's door, invading a room that for 8 months had held only the smell of disinfectant and delivery boxes. At 11 p.m., Baylor heard his bare feet on the floorboards. Tyson stood in the doorway, a portrait of devastation. 3 sleepless days had carved deep shadows under his eyes. His fists were clenched so hard a faint tremor ran through them. But he was here. He had left his self-imposed cell, lowered by a promise carried on the air, a foundational instinct that not even a bomb could erase. Baylor offered no empty comforts about sleep or the coming day. Facades of hope he would instantly recognize as lies. She just put a plate in front of him, chicken soup, pasta, and a thick slice of warm bread slathered with butter. Her food came with a 6-word oath. Eat, sleep, I will guard the door. Tyson's gaze moved from her to the plate and back to her, and then he ate, clearing the entire plate. For the first time, he did not wait for her to test it for poison. Even his fractured mind understood that the woman who had filled his home with the aroma of safety was not the one who would deliver his death. He returns to his room, and Baylor takes her station. She pulls a chair to his door, starting a silent watch under the hall's dim light. She was an unmoving guardian, a sentinel, repeating her duty from her mother's hospital bed, from the floor of his wrecked office, and every night from his living room, a bulwark against the night. And against all odds, Tyson slept. For the first time in 8 months, he found 6 straight hours of rest, free of phantom blasts and the looping horror of his dreams. A guardian at the door and the scent of home within had succeeded where pharmacology had failed. It was a raw display of dominance. Tyson Kane walked into the boardroom at 7 o'clock that evening. Instantly, the 12 men around the oak table went still, their voices vanishing, as if stolen from the air. Months of stubble were gone, his jaw now a hard, chiseled line of granite-like resolve. Bennett had chosen his attire, a black 3-piece suit that screamed not of money, but of unchallenged authority. Bennett recognized the look in his gray-blue eyes, a chilling focus unseen for 8 months, sharp, glacial, and total. As his eyes scanned the faces present, every man felt the stare as a personal, unsettling violation. The irony was breathtaking. Just 12 hours ago, he had been a shivering mess in his own kitchen, ravaged by 3 days without sleep, his hands raw and bleeding. No one here knew that truth. Only Baylor and Bennett had seen it. For Tyson knew what the explosion hadn't destroyed. That power is pure theater, and this audience demanded a king. Frank sat at the table's head, the usurper playing the role of protector. He gave Tyson a smile as he entered, a mask of pained worry, the look of an uncle doing a difficult but necessary thing. If Baylor had been there, she would have known that smile. He'd worn it while bringing white lilies to the penthouse. It was the same impeccable mask. Frank started talking, his tone gentle and filled with a rehearsed grief. He presented this gathering not as a coup, but as a solemn duty, claiming profound concern for his nephew's well-being. The organization's stability, he declared, had to come before blood ties. He laid out his case, a record of 12 caretakers who had quit and medical files judging Tyson incapable. His final move was to suggest a temporary shift in leadership for everyone's benefit, pending Tyson's recovery. The 4-minute performance was a clinic in manipulation. A heavy quiet followed, the sort where powerful men weigh their options and choose a side. Tyson did not move. He stayed back in his chair, hands flat on the table, radiating an unbothered tranquility. When he spoke, the sound was devoid of the broken fury from his office or the frantic energy from the night his last caretaker left. His voice was level and sharp, a scalpel slicing through the thick atmosphere. My Uncle Frank is concerned about my health, he started, turning the word concerned into a palpable accusation. And for that, I'm immensely thankful. But before this council decides anything, I have one question for all of you. Only one. His stare, a sliver of polar ice, traveled across each face until it locked onto Frank. Which of you can tell me why the car I was in, the one meant to be my casket, had its last maintenance check at a shop covertly owned by my Uncle Frank? The silence in the room didn't just grow, it imploded, creating a void. The air crackled. For 3 whole seconds, 12 powerful men forgot how to breathe. Had Baylor been listening, she might have thought those 3 seconds were a lifetime. The same 3 seconds Tyson heard the telltale click just before his world erupted in flames. This time, however, those 3 seconds were Frank's alone. His public face held firm. The smile never wavered. His body was a statue of composure. A man doesn't shatter after 62 years over one question. But his eyes went completely hollow. Baylor couldn't have seen it, but Bennett, watching from his position, knew precisely what it meant. Tyson said nothing else. He didn't have to. He had dropped the truth in the center of the table, an armed explosive, forcing each man to choose his distance. The vote he'd proposed was now an impossibility. The word postponed was never even spoken. The very idea of a vote vanished into thin air. Defying a sitting boss is dangerous. Defying one who just implicated an opponent in his own attempted murder is pure suicide. Not one man there wished to be remembered for choosing the wrong side. Frank left soon after Tyson, his back straight, his smile perfect. But he left, and that was all that mattered. Downstairs, 4 levels deep in the garage, Baylor Finch sat inside Bennett's black SUV, clutching her own legs until her knuckles were pale bone. On the dashboard, Bennett's phone transmitted the entire event. She'd listened to Frank's slick, insincere speech. She'd sensed the suffocating quiet that followed. She'd heard Tyson's question spoken in a toneless, deadly cadence she'd only heard stories about. This was the man he was before the explosion. There, in the stark chill of the garage, she understood the real reason people feared him. She heard the 3 seconds of quiet that mirrored his death, and the subsequent collapse of the meeting's purpose. Only then did she exhale a breath she hadn't known was trapped in her lungs. She relaxed her hands, finding half-moon imprints where her fingernails had dug into her skin. A cold clarity hit her. She had been rooting for a mob boss to win his internal war. It had nothing to do with the $47,000 anymore. It was about him, the man who ate pancakes at 3 a.m., who guarded her door at 4, who wielded a simple kitchen knife like a weapon. the same man who recounted the 3 most terrifying seconds of his life while they shared a meal of cold noodles. That realization was far more terrifying than anything Frank Kane could ever plot. Frank could only take over a criminal enterprise. This emotion could take over her spirit. Frank retaliated 3 days later. He wasn't a man who accepted a loss gracefully. He was one to flip the board over. He used a 19-year-old girl with a slight limp as his weapon on her way back from the campus library one Wednesday. Bennett's man assigned to Pearl was given a forged order to pull back, with a false assurance that she was safe. A fake order sent through a real communication line since Frank, though ousted, still had privileges no one had bothered to cancel. Once the guard left, Pearl disappeared somewhere in the 4 blocks to her home. It was a walk that usually took 15 minutes, and 15 unprotected minutes was all Frank needed. Bennett called Baylor at 6 o'clock that evening with a brief 2-line update. Pearl never made it to her dorm. A search team is out. Standing in the penthouse kitchen, Baylor felt the floor vanish from under her, a sensation that was frighteningly real. The air in her lungs grew thin, unable to sustain her. The world around her blurred into a distant, unimportant background. There was only one thing left in focus: a young woman with a bad leg, lost somewhere in the vastness of Chicago. She had already watched her mother fade away over long, agonizing days. That experience had forged her endurance for pain, but it had also shown her the single thing she could never endure: losing Pearl. Pearl was the reason for the dead-end delivery gigs. Pearl was why she took $47,000 from a murderer. Pearl was why she stayed in this gilded cage. Pearl was all that remained. Without her, Baylor Finch was nothing. She found Tyson in the living room. Bennett had already told him. He was standing. Not just standing, but poised, his body taut like a bowstring pulled to its limit. His gray-blue eyes held the same frigid, piercing quality she had seen in the boardroom. But this was something else. Deeper, harder, and far more dangerous. Before, it was a threat. This time, it was a promise of retribution. Baylor stood in front of him, offering no tears, pleas, or cries. She was completely still. Her silence was more disquieting than all the noise from the 12 caretakers who came before her. It was the quiet of a person pushed to the very edge, using all their strength just to stay on their feet. Tyson looked at her, then did something he had never done in his 36 years of life, something his entire world forbade. He apologized. "I'm sorry," he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue, as if spoken in a language he was only just learning. It was a skill he had never needed to learn. "I will get Pearl back," he promised. "Not because you work for me, but because you stayed. I owe you something that money can't repay." 40 minutes after that, 2 black SUVs carrying Tyson, Bennett, and 4 other men were racing south. Using the city's hidden network, Bennett had tracked a signal to an abandoned warehouse in the back of the yards. It was an industrial skeleton, a crumbling relic from a version of Chicago that knew nothing of luxury suites and tailored suits. Tyson walked into the warehouse, Bennett right behind him. And Bennett, who had been by his side for 15 years, saw that the person entering that building was someone completely different. This wasn't the blind rage of the last 8 months. This was clear-headed, calculated lethality. He was fully in control, moving with the deadly efficiency of his former self, but now driven by something that man never had. His purpose had nothing to do with his empire. It was bound to the sister of the woman in the penthouse who was waiting for him to bring Pearl home. The details of what occurred in that warehouse are best left to the imagination. It is enough to know Pearl was found in a room at the back, bound but not broken. She was terrified, but she was alive. And the men who took her were about to enter a new, dark chapter orchestrated by Frank Kane's miscalculation. Bennett drove them through the city's veins, Pearl, a shrouded figure in his back seat. Baylor was a statue by the elevators. As the doors slid open and Pearl stepped out, Baylor clutched her sister with a ferocity only understood by those who have stared into the abyss. In that moment, Baylor became a shield, walling Pearl off from a world that had fractured. Pearl shattered into sobs, but Baylor's eyes were stone dry. Her tears had run out 2 years ago with her mother's death. She just held on. 3 meters away, Tyson was frozen, his hands stained with blood that wasn't his. He yearned to move, but his feet were anchors. A look at his hands confirmed it. His darkness had no place in their light. This was a sacrament for 2 sisters, and he was the gargoyle on the cathedral wall. So he kept his distance, close enough to see, too far to defile it. Over Pearl's shoulder, Baylor's gaze found his. Her warm, brown eyes seemed to drill straight into his center. The 62nd floor lobby was utterly silent, the air heavy with the scent of blood and old bread. Her stare said everything her lips could not, and some broken part of him understood its meaning. Bennett would later offer the most chilling verdict possible. "I have served you for 15 years. Tonight was the first time I was truly afraid of you. Not because you lost your mind, but because you were in absolute, terrifying control." The next morning, Tyson faced Frank in his office. No crew, no backup. This was Kane business. Frank sat, draped in a gray suit, looking unnervingly calm. His most lethal weapon, this capacity to watch a world end without blinking. Tyson, however, stood his ground, making Frank look up. In their world, the man looking up has already lost. He placed an envelope on the desk. Within lay the ammunition, service records, 8 months of Bennett's reports, and logs showing the false alarm to Pearl's detail was triggered by one of Frank's shell companies. Tyson's voice was disturbingly level, laced with a quiet poison. 2 paths. You walk away from Chicago forever, or this lands on an FBI agent's desk Monday. It was not enough to secure a conviction, but it was more than enough to start a fire that would burn the Kane empire to the ground. A move Frank had used on a rival 30 years prior. Our blood gives you the privilege of walking out, not being carried. Frank's eyes darted between the file and Tyson. For a fleeting second, the 62-year-old man's mask slipped. He was just a man facing impossible odds. Frank chose to walk. No final words were uttered, just a slight dip of his head, the gesture of a king acknowledging checkmate. Tyson turned and left, and the 2 Kane men would never be in the same room again. That night, a new quiet fell over the penthouse. Pearl was safe, with a new team on her door. This was not the lonely silence from before Baylor, nor the menacing silence of Frank's threat. This was the stillness after a war, the kind of quiet where you can taste rain in the air, where everything is damaged but still standing. And Baylor's reaction? She was washing the dishes, because no matter what psychological battle had just been won, no matter who was saved or who was cast out, the dishes were still dirty. Baylor Finch was the type to fix the small things, to stop the big things from breaking her. Tyson appeared in the kitchen. She knew his footsteps now, heavier and more careful near her, as if each one was a negotiation. He halted behind her, his familiar silence filling the space between them. She'd learned it was an inquisitive quiet from a man who found words difficult. "You stayed," he finally said. "I told you I would," she answered, hands deep the soapy water. "Why?" "The truth?" Baylor killed the tap, dried her hands, and at last turned to face him. Tyson Kane, in his own kitchen, a room where 4 weeks ago she'd found tax forms stored in the oven. But tonight it felt like a home. His gray-blue eyes asked the question he had been screaming in silence all along, when he had stood like a sentinel at her door at 4 in the morning, when he talked of 3 seconds over noodles, when he stood 3 meters away with bloodied hands. It had always been the same question. Now she gave him the answer. "Because you held a kitchen knife," she started, "like it was a weapon. But you let me fix your grip. A man who lets someone reteach him something so basic hasn't quit because you stood at my door at 4 a.m., not to knock, but just to know I was still there. That's not crazy." That is what someone does when they are so lonely they're afraid of sleep, terrified to wake up alone one more time. And because you stood 3 meters away while I held Pearl with blood on your hands, afraid you would taint the moment. A man who sees his own darkness and chooses not to let it touch the one thing he wants to protect. That man isn't the monster they say he is. She met his eyes. "Under all your broken pieces, you're the kindest man I was never supposed to find." In that space, Tyson kisses her, or she kisses him. It was a point they would argue forever. The moment was like a sudden downpour. You don't ask which drop of rain came first, you just know the storm has arrived. There, in a kitchen on the 62nd floor, 2 people carrying the weight of worlds finally put their burdens down and held on to each other. A month later, the apartment was unrecognizable, not because of what was new, but because it was finally filled with life. This new life smelled like garlic in the mornings and looked like the fine sheen of flour Baylor always left on the countertops. It sounded like Pearl's laughter from video calls, from a new, brighter apartment, a place built for someone relearning how to breathe. Pearl had started physical therapy, her weekly videos charting the slow return of power to her legs. Baylor would watch them in the kitchen, then set her phone down and cook because watching any longer risked violating the strict no crying before noon policy of Baylor Finch. The penthouse kitchen was now the center of this new universe. The balcony, once home to a few sad pots, was a thriving herb garden. It grew basil, thyme, rosemary, and mint. The mint planted only because Tyson liked its scent in his tea at night. He had never been a tea drinker, but he cherished it now as the first smell of morning, a confirmation that she was still there. Every day at noon, the security detail queued up for lunch because Baylor always cooked for a crowd. And Bennett Shaw, the unflappable operator, was always at the front of that line. His official story was security checks, a fiction they both acknowledged. The truth was, in the food container he held like a sacred object. Tyson's demons had not fled. There were nights he didn't sleep, and times the paranoia returned, making him stare into empty space and speak to no one. But now, when he rose at 3 in the morning and wandered into the kitchen, he was met. She would be there, hair a mess, asking what the shadows were saying tonight, her voice as ordinary as if asking if rain was forecast, as if she were simply asking what he wanted for breakfast. That simple act of treating his madness as mundane was a medicine no doctor could prescribe. Their arguments were the foundation of their life, loud, constant, and raw. It was the collision of a man with no filter against a woman who refused to break. She'd rage about his cameras. He'd fire back about her trips to the market alone. She'd attack his diet. He'd complain about the jungle on the balcony. Yet, Their fights were never cruel, they were honest, the kind of battle you can only have when you respect someone enough to fight clean and then eat a meal 5 minutes later. 12 women had come and gone. 12 times the truth Tyson Kane believed was proven. He was too scarred, too unstable, too far gone. He was a forest fire that scared off other fires. Then the 13th person showed up, who was not a caregiver. She was a delivery driver with scarred hands, a thermal bag, and the unique courage of a woman with nothing left to lose. She wasn't looking for a storm. Her entire life had been one long hurricane of pain, sickness, and grief. So when she faced the maelstrom of Tyson Kane, she did not flinch. She only asked how long the storm had raged and if he had eaten. Her purpose was not to mend him, but to feed him, to endure the quiet beside him, to remain. The 12 who came before were not incompetent. They were simply ill-suited for the gilded cage of his penthouse. They applied for a job but encountered a cataclysm. Baylor was not seeking employment. She was searching for a haven that understood profound sorrow. And she found it on the 62nd floor in a vast kitchen with a man who held a knife like a natural limb, yet let her correct his grip from the first day. Some love stories are about two whole people finding each other. This is not that kind of story. This is about two broken people discovering how their shattered pieces might fit. Not perfectly, not gently, and certainly not in any way the world would expect. It was like two separate infernos converging within the confines of a kitchen, too hot for any outsider to withstand, too resolute to be extinguished and molded perfectly for one another. That is the tale of Tyson Kane and Baylor Finch, and that kitchen was their forge. Perhaps the real truth is not about love at all, but about endurance. That at times the greatest act of courage is not to conquer, but simply to witness another's darkness without demanding a light. It is a reminder that no one is so shattered they are unworthy of someone asking, "What did the shadows say to you tonight?" And that sometimes the place we belong is not flawless, but merely vast enough to hold all our broken parts. If their story connected with you, please like this video so it might find others. Share it with someone who you feel needs to hear this, and subscribe for more explorations of the human soul. We are deeply curious how this narrative made you feel. If you saw your reflection in Baylor, in Tyson, or in the one who stayed, please share your thoughts below because every story deserves an audience. We wish all of you listening health, happiness, and peace in your lives. We appreciate you sharing this time with us. Until the next story begins, good night.
Life lesson: healing begins when a person feels safe enough to stop performing strength. From a clinical perspective, Tyson presents as a man whose traumatic injury has fused with pre-existing behavioral conditioning. His post-bomb symptoms, hypervigilance, paranoia, aggression, intrusive sensory recall, emotional disinhibition, do not emerge in a vacuum. They are intensified by a lifetime inside organized violence where trust is maladaptive and emotional exposure is punishable. In other words, Tyson is not merely broken. He is a systemically trained mind experiencing catastrophic psychological destabilization. This distinction matters. Most observers misread trauma when it appears in abrasive form. Society is far more comfortable with the suffering victim than with the dangerous one. Yet many traumatized individuals display irritability, control-seeking suspicion, and rage, especially when their internal world feels chronically unsafe. Tyson's volatility is therefore not proof of monstrosity. It is evidence of a nervous system unable to distinguish between present safety and remembered threat. Baylor's impact is psychologically significant because she offers something rare: co-regulation without humiliation. She does not challenge his fear with argument, which would escalate defensiveness. She does not infantilize him, which would reinforce shame. Instead, she normalizes his need for safety through practical routines: food, light, presence, predictable responses, non-reactive companionship. These interventions may appear domestic, but clinically they are profound. She reduces uncertainty, she lowers threat perception, she becomes a stable external anchor. The life lesson here is not sentimental, it is precise. Human beings do not heal in environments where they must constantly prove control. They heal where control is no longer the price of dignity. Tyson begins to stabilize not when he is overpowered, but when he is permitted to be frightened without being abandoned for it. That is an extraordinary therapeutic condition, even outside fiction. There is a second lesson embedded here as well. Baylor herself is shaped by chronic hardship, caregiving fatigue, financial trauma, grief, survival-based hyperfunctioning. Yet she recognizes Tyson because pain often identifies pain before language does. This does not mean wounded people are obligated to fix one another. It means that those who have suffered sometimes detect what healthier, more detached observers cannot. Ultimately, the story demonstrates a critical truth about human behavior. Beneath many destructive personalities lies a terrified organism protecting itself with the only strategies it has ever trusted. Real change begins not when that organism is condemned, but when it encounters a relationship safer than its defenses.